Good morning. We will now go ahead and start this session. I'm Christina Finch. I'm the head of the Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Department at ODIHR, and I would like to welcome all participants to this session. I want to remind that speakers can only take the floor in the capacity in which they are registered, and only entities registered on the speakers list can be represented. As always, seats in the HGym plenary hall are designated and indicated on signs around the table, and all participants are kindly asked throughout the session to respect the seating arrangement. Let me also remind that live streaming of the 2018 HGym is available. Filming with cameras and video cameras is only permitted by accredited journalists. Please, no other audio-visual recordings should be undertaken without the explicit permission of the individuals being filmed. We are expecting that interventions will be presented in a meaningful, orderly, and respectful manner. And we would kindly like to ask you to submit it when possible to the interpreters in advance and to distribution to ensure that the flow of documents reflect the discussion. These can be provided to the documentation desk in the front of the plenary hall. And the speaker's biographical information for this session will be displayed on screens. And I would like now to introduce the session. Please welcome to working session 6, Tolerance and Non-Discrimination, including combating anti-Semitism, combating intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief, including against Christians, Muslims, and members of other religions. The questions that we will be addressing in this session are: how are the OSCE participating states ensuring the implementation of the OSCE Ministerial Council decisions number 1007, number 1306, and number 1005 on tolerance and non-discrimination, particularly for members of religious communities? What are the challenges that participating states face in this regard? What progress have participating states made in establishing action plans and strategies to address intolerance and discrimination on religious grounds and promote the culture of tolerance and diversity, including in disputed territories? Which steps can be taken in order to better explore and effectively address the different effects that various manifestations of religious intolerance and discrimination can have on men and women? What is the role of non-state actors, such as educational, media, or the religious community, in addressing intolerance and discrimination, particularly against members of different religions, and promoting tolerance, diversity, and understanding? And finally, how can ODIHR and other OSCE institutions, including the 3 personal representatives of the chairperson in office, better support participating states in implementing their commitments relating to tolerance and non-discrimination based on religious grounds? With these questions in mind, I would like to now give the floor to our first introducer, Dr. Emilia Roig, the director of the Center for Intersectional Justice in Berlin. Dr. Roig, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, members of the Human Implementation Development Meeting, dear colleagues, it is a true honor for me to be here today, and I would like to thank the OSCE for inviting me to introduce this important session. Everywhere in Europe, we see groups of people claiming entitlement to certain privileges and also claim the right to define the confines of European identity. The most recent example are the massive demonstrations of neo-Nazis in Germany and in Chemnitz and other cities. Also in France, right-wing extremists called Génération Identitaire blocked the Col de l'Échelle in the Alps with a fence and helicopters to prevent migrants from coming in, denouncing the lack of courage of the public authorities. The same group has erected a wall in front of a future reception center of asylum seekers in Montpellier in France. Everywhere in Europe, we see old patterns resurfacing in society, be it in public discourses, social practices and interactions, media representations, and state regulations. In June 2018, there was the plan in Italy to create a census of Roma people with a view to deporting those without papers. We see that some fully belong and are entitled to participation and representation, and that others do not fully belong and are merely tolerated. An example is that 40% of Roma children are placed in segregated schools in classrooms in Hungary. I take this opportunity to express some thoughts about the word tolerance when speaking of participation, justice, equality, and non-discrimination. Using the words tolerance or intolerance should prompt us to ask some important questions. Who tolerates whom? Who has the political, cultural, and economic power to tolerate? Are all people, religious, ethnic, cultural communities on a level playing field? On the one hand, tolerance is a very positively connoted word, especially from a spiritual point of view, which conveys the idea of acceptance and community. According to the Oxford Dictionary, tolerance describes the ability or willingness to tolerate the existence of opinions or behaviors that one dislikes or disagrees with. But it also conveys the idea of a level playing field where all communities should mutually accept each other. While this is true, we should also remember that when we speak about discrimination, exclusion, and marginalization, what is also at play are power dynamics and oppression. It means that all communities are not on a level playing field, but that some enjoy more political, cultural, and economic power than others. In other words, it means that even though intolerance can be experienced within and from all communities without exception, the social and political impact of this intolerance widely differs. Only groups who hold political power will have the ability to enforce their intolerance towards other groups. On the contrary, groups who do not hold enough political power will not be able to enforce their prejudice against other communities or groups of people. This is why the notion of minority is so crucial to understanding these power dynamics and the effects they produce. For this reason, I prefer the term structural exclusion to the term intolerance in a political context, simply because intolerance overlooks the structural and systemic aspects of discrimination. And the main reason is that we're aiming for a society where power is equally distributed among various groups and people and communities. Discrimination has always four dimensions: the individual dimension, the structural, institutional dimension, and the historical dimension. In the current European legal anti-discrimination framework, an almost exclusive emphasis is put on the individual dimension of discrimination: intentional behavior and discriminatory opinions, hate speech, and violence. It means that the wider context is all too often overlooked, including the role that institutions and the people within these institutions play, the unintended effects of certain laws and policies, the media representation of certain religious communities or ethnic groups. And discrimination thus presupposes that three main elements come together. The first one is difference. In order for discrimination to take place, there needs to be difference. Difference that are mostly socially, historically, and politically constructed. There needs to be power, the power to enforce prejudice or intolerance. And then the last one is hierarchization, because differences without hierarchization would not be so difficult to deal with. Similarly, we cannot analyze discrimination without considering the historical legacy of past systems, which continue to mark our current political systems, norms, values, and representations. Understanding anti-Semitism and anti-Roma racism in Germany and Europe today, without considering World War II, would provide an incomplete analysis of this phenomenon. Similarly, understanding anti-Muslim racism in France or Belgium without considering the colonial history of those countries would be misguided. Racism, discrimination, xenophobia, intolerance, nationalism are all sides of the same coin. Even though each has their own specificities, they share the same roots and rest on the same system, meant to hierarchize people according to would-be races, which of course do not exist. Religions like skin color, nationalities, languages, and ethnicity are undergoing a process of so-called racialization in Western Europe mostly, meaning that members of certain religious groups are being constructed as a racial identity, racial entity. This racialization process started after 9/11 and spilled out everywhere in the world. Jewish and Roma communities underwent a long racialization process through the 19th and 20th centuries, and even before, but it culminated there. The very historical, political, and economic systems that uphold the idea that all people are not equal and some are intrinsically superior than others is the backbone of intolerance, discrimination, and xenophobia. This is why it is absolutely crucial to adopt an intersectional approach to the fight against these societal plagues. It means we need to understand these phenomena as mutually reinforcing and intertwined. Discrimination and racism against Jews, Muslims, Blacks, Roma, Sinti, Roma and Sinti Asians, and other minorities should always be fought at the same level, with the same intensity and at the same time creating an inter-community solidarity. I would like to draw attention to one particular religious minority whose fundamental rights are particularly under threat in Europe: Muslim women wearing the hijab. This is a typical case of indirect discrimination and intersectional discrimination. Laws, local regulations, and formal practices prohibiting the wearing of religious dress in employment, education, services, and public space result in Muslim women being disproportionately prevented from exercising their rights. Analysis shows that these restrictions stem from openly racist and discriminatory political narratives coming from the far right and mainstream political discourses. A report released in April 2018 by the Open Society Foundations entitled Restrictions on Muslim Women's Dress in 20 EU member states identified that many states have a variety of laws restricting Muslim women's dress. In EU countries that are known to have high standards against discrimination and to promote pluralism and inclusion, like Sweden, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and others, there is no increasing pressure to introduce religious dress bans that restrict freedoms and exclude religious minorities from society. Campaigns for such laws and regulations have failed in many places, and where they have been adopted, they have faced political and legal resistance by Muslim women, grassroots civil society, national courts, and even governments. Another report conducted in 2016 by the European Network Against Racism called Forgotten Women draws similar conclusions, stating that, for example, in Belgium, 44% of employers agree that wearing a headscarf can negatively influence the selection of candidates. The lack of protection of Muslim women's fundamental rights resulting from such bans should be addressed by member states on several grounds. First, equal opportunity for women and men in all spheres of life and promotion of gender equality. And then second, rights of persons belonging to national minorities. But Muslim women tend to disappear in the group national minorities as well as in the group women. Similarly, it is difficult to prove that this discrimination they face occurs simultaneously on two or more grounds: gender, race, religion. This is why adopting an intersectional approach to anti-discrimination is absolutely crucial to ensure that no one falls through the cracks. To conclude, I would say that all actions meant to combat anti-Semitism, intolerance, and discrimination based on religion or belief, including against Christians, Muslims, and members of other religions, should be based on intersectionality, meaning that all grounds of discrimination should be combated and with the view that they are mutually reinforcing. Second, a structural analysis of these phenomena, racism, discrimination, and exclusionary practices and laws should always be analyzed from a structural perspective, looking at the role and responsibility of societal structures and state institutions. And finally, systemic understanding of racism, whereby culprits and victims are no longer central to the fight against racism. It means moving away from an understanding of racism as just intolerant opinions and intentional behavior towards an understanding of racism as a political, social, historical system embedded in each of us and in all areas of life and society. In order to combat it, we need to start with ourselves. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roig. I now turn to Dr. Zilka Safek-Siljak from Foundation TPO. Doctor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm really honored to participate to this event today. Good morning, everyone. My presentation is about overcoming secular religious divide in order to reduce discrimination and intolerance. One of the challenges to active tolerance and non-discrimination faced by many societies today is the question of translating the language of human rights, including freedom of religion, into practice. So far, we have tried to resolve most conflicts between secular and religious understanding of human rights through legal norms and court practices. As it turns out, we didn't find a model of better communication between the two and enable more constructive, collaborative learning practices. My work in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Balkans in the last 20 years shows that discriminatory practices against ethnic and religious minorities, women, disabled persons, LGBTQ, and many other groups haven't been overcome yet. And in order to confront these practices, we need to properly address secular religious divide. In the post-secular era, some authors emphasize the disastrous consequences of dualism that divide religious and secular, individual and communal, rational and irrational. They propose a relational dialogism as means for going beyond the imposed dualism in international politics, which can also be applied more broadly to social and political life in local communities in order to bring about social change. Relational dialogism is a framework that opens up the possibility of understanding religion and politics not as two separate and completely divided spheres of life, but as two spheres that are constantly changing, shifting, and impacting each other. In the Balkans, the gap between secular and religious understanding of human rights, freedom of speech, reconciliation, and development is still enormous, and there hasn't been a great deal of collaborative work, nor so far has religion been employed as a driver of change in resolving national or global issues. Some faith-based initiatives challenge ethnic divisions, religious dogmatism, and status quo polity, and they foster further development of civil society and peace building in the region. What is also important is that spiritual capital brought by faith-based activists moves beyond mere bonding between members of the same faith communities. It also helps to bridge the secular religious divide and reduce discrimination. So the dichotomy between private religious and public secular still prevails, and the only way to overcome existing divisions and exclusion is to adopt relational dialogism approach. I will briefly mention two positive examples from the post-conflict Bosnian context. The initiative of monotheistic three voices, launched by International Multi-Religious and Intercultural Center Image Zajedno, run by Franciscan priest Marko Oršolić, and Global Ethic in Schools, run by Transcultural Psychosocial Educational Foundation from Sarajevo. The two initiatives both demonstrate how relational dialogism functions in ethnically divided educational system. The idea between the two initiatives was to bring teachers and students together to connect and to reconnect and to build something new, a new ethos of tolerance and mutual understanding. So far, over 700 teachers of social science and humanities, including teachers of religious education, were prepared on how to build an ethos with key common ethical values for all children, notwithstanding their ethnic or religious backgrounds. So far, the initiative has managed to integrate some of the global ethic contents into the official curriculum. However, in the ongoing debate regarding religious education in the region, we should stretch relational dialogism to deal with not only secularist dualism that defined religion as irrational, institutional, and individual, but also religious biases that perceive secularism as godless, profane, materialistic, and self-centered. Both perspectives should allow the understanding of both secularism and religion to be reconceptualized, as well as be prepared to transcend obstacles that serve dualistic polarization. To conclude, neither secularism nor religion has recipes for every problem in a society, But since they both serve, or better to say should serve, and take care of well-being of their people, they can fulfill their mission if they work together, without diminishing and undermining of each other's roles. An important part of relational dialogism is to start with self-criticism and open windows of catharsis for one's own community, but also to come up with some concrete solution. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Slojak. I now give the floor to Rabbi Andrew Baker, personal representative of the OSCE Chairperson in Office on Combating Anti-Semitism. Rabbi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christina. 15 years have passed since the OSCE held its first conference on anti-Semitism. It addressed specific matters relevant to the issue, including the importance of understanding and defining it, the need for education about Judaism in the Jewish community, and the value in promoting Holocaust education and remembrance. It underscored the obligation for governments to identify and monitor hate crimes, the need to train police and prosecutors, and to teach students about religion and religious communities generally. In that pre-social media era, it flagged concerns about the spread of hate on the internet and the responsibility of traditional media to avoid promoting intolerance. It offered the OSCE as a place for governments to share best practices and to prod its participating states to do more. Before the conference had come to an end, the German delegation proposed that it would host a follow-up conference in Berlin the following year. That conference and the Berlin Declaration that resulted from it were a milestone in efforts by the OSCE to tackle the problem of anti-Semitism. It began a process of defining anti-Semitism as it relates to Israel. It spoke of anti-Semitism taking on new forms and manifestations. It made clear that incidents in Israel and the Middle East could never justify anti-Semitic attacks. We must acknowledge that anti-Semitism in the OSCE region is no less a problem today than it was 15 years ago. But we are better able today to understand it. Governments are more willing to acknowledge it, and we have more tools at our disposal to address it. But let's also acknowledge today's environment is not the same as it was 15 years ago. In 2003, we had not fully appreciated the very real security challenges that Jewish communities faced, the genuine anxiety that many Jews have come to feel just in the public observance of their faith. It has taken lethal attacks and physical harassment to immobilize authorities. We must acknowledge the complicated, the even contradictory forces on our work to combat anti-Semitism connected to immigration and the politics of immigration. Large numbers of migrants have come from majority Muslim countries in the Middle East and North Africa, where anti-Jewish and anti-Israel sentiments are commonplace. We don't know yet that this will mean an increase in anti-Semitism, but it surely adds to the challenges of integrating them and to standing concerns about anti-Semitism from parts of the more established Muslim communities. At the same time, these immigrants themselves are victims of prejudice, and they're being used to fuel the campaigns of right-wing populist parties. Their support is growing, and these parties and their members are no less anti-Semitic than they are anti-Muslim. Even as more countries promote Holocaust education and designate official commemoration days, we see in some places where the Holocaust took place a growing distortion of that history. This includes the veneration of fascist-era heroes, the inability to acknowledge the role and responsibility of local collaborators, and even outright opposition to critical analysis. For Jewish communities composed primarily of Holocaust survivors and their descendants, this is much more than a question of history. It goes to their very sense of belonging. There has been very real progress in employing a comprehensive definition of anti-Semitism. That first working definition issued by the EUMC in 2005 was essentially adopted by the 31-member nation International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in 2016. It's been recommended for use by the European Parliament in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. A growing number of countries have formally adopted it and put it to use. Only last week, the Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom and the Archbishop of Canterbury jointly endorsed the definition with its full list of examples and without any modifications, a very public condemnation of anti-Semitism in the political arena. In closing, let me speak a moment to ODIHR's Words into Action program. Its guidelines for governments on Jewish community security provide clear and succinct measures for law enforcement to follow and important recommendations drawn from practical experience. Its recently released guidelines on education to combat anti-Semitism should serve a similar purpose in shaping curricula and supplemental efforts to inform the attitudes of students. Thus, I very much hope and would urge ODIHR, with the support of civil society and the participating states, to build on the success of the Words into Action project. Let's move to sustain and disseminate these first guidelines addressing security and education and work to see that they're adopted and expanded. And yes, at the same time, let's redouble efforts to develop the proper and necessary programs to fight intolerance and discrimination against Muslims, and to fight racism and xenophobia and discrimination against Christians and other religions. Surely there will be donors willing to support them as well. As we learned back in 2004, the commitment of participating states and the capacity of ODIHR to fight intolerance and discrimination go together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Baker. I would now like to give the floor to Professor Salvatore Martinez, the personal representative of the OSCE Chairperson in Office on combating racism, xenophobia, and discrimination, also focusing on intolerance and discrimination against Christians and members of other religions. Professor Martinez, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. I speak in Italian language. Eccellenze,
Excellencies, members of international organizations, dear friends, thank you for your attention. I would like to begin by saying that the times in which we are living are seeing a deep anthropological crisis which stems from a deep spiritual crisis. Many think that the solution would be to exclude God from humanity or to limit the role of religions and the following of a real faith by peoples and communities. The right to faith is a key human right, and it is increasingly violated, and it is used as a source of intolerance and discrimination. We must reverse this trend, especially in Europe, where we tend to minimize and also conceal the scope of discrimination and intolerance which are based on religious grounds. Let me give you 3 examples. If a church is desecrated or pillaged, and this occurs in about 200 churches every month throughout the world, well, it will not be portrayed as a case of discrimination against Christians, but rather as a mere act of vandalism. If artists portray Jesus Christ or the Virgin Mary in an offensive or blasphemous way, this will not be considered discrimination against Christians. Rather, it will be considered part of modernity and the right to exercise artistic freedom and freedom of expression. If people beat a priest or a nun or people who have gathered in a church, this will not be considered as discrimination against Christians, but rather a manifestation of the social malaise amongst young people, which is vented in forms of violence. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 19 binds the word freedom with 3 expressions that cannot be separated or used in contradiction with each other: the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. These are 3 undividable freedoms which amount to one. It is 3 in 1 here, and this reveals the transcendental essence of mankind. We cannot limit the freedom of religion. We should also ask ourselves whether social or ideological consciousness can, in the name of freedom of conscience, provide a framework for freedom of religion. If you turn to Article 18, I think that we must do so consistently and with coherence. From the moment when this can have an impact on our democracy, it is important to do so, and our democracies have religious roots. The very future of our peoples and humanity is at stake here. In order to promote religious freedom, we must reaffirm the right to exercise one's religion. This is a public right which belongs and pertains to fundamental freedoms. In our states, there is something that is particularly critical right now. These religious rights are compared to social rights, and efforts to try and regulate this form of freedom, that is to say, to regulate the forms in which it can be expressed and exercised, means that states are gaining control over the exercise of this freedom as if it were a mere social right. If you look at what's happening in our countries, you see that there are 4 main areas on which we ought to try and find a common way forward. First of all, there is the fact that religious freedom is guaranteed when it is guaranteed as a freedom of faith. That means that each individual should have the autonomy to choose their own religious faith, or to not have a religious creed, or to have the right to change that faith. Secondly, religious freedom is guaranteed when it is guaranteed as the freedom to worship. That means that it must be a freedom to celebrate rites and to follow one's own confession. This is extremely important because many rites are not linked merely to worshipping, but to ancient traditions which go back a very long way and which are characteristic of a people's identity. They regulate the life of an ethnic group, of a community, of a family, and they are also part and parcel of education very often. Thirdly, the freedom of religion is guaranteed when the freedom of religious expression is guaranteed. So when people are allowed to form their own conscience, and this must be a neutral system. This is when we see how religion dovetails with the freedom to information. Fourthly, religious freedom is guaranteed when the freedom to belong to a religious association is also ensured. And this freedom must also be ensured at a collective level. So there must be the right to belong to a collective religious community where each individual has the right to meet with others in order to practice their faith. It is also important to look at what is happening in terms of generations. I think it is essential to bring young people on board in our efforts. Young people are disaffected at the moment when it comes to interculturality and religious diversity. We need to have young people act as the new interpreters of religious freedoms, for they are the future actors of our communities, and that is one of the key messages that I wanted to get across. We must invest more in the education and training of new leaders in order to make sure that the new leadership that emerges from it is interdisciplinary and interreligious. Young people who are suffering should be able to come together as we, their parents, are in conflict with each other. There is a systemic crisis right now which is placing in jeopardy the very survival of our societies as we have known them. And this loss of identity, which is very complex but which affects our communities, must be reined in. We must therefore renew with our traditional heritage, which is made up of diverse cultures and traditions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Martinez. I now give the floor to Professor Boulat-Chenay, the personal representative of the OSCE Chairperson in Office on Combating Intolerance and Discrimination Against Muslims. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, moderator. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's been 26 years for me since I found myself dealing with this work of combating anti-Muslim intolerance and discrimination. The global resurgence of religion, the increasing social unrest, and the rampant violence that we are witnessing today, from Myanmar to the Middle East and in various parts of the OSCE region, should be a clarion call for a peaceful framework for a common public life. Instead, we see more and more that while discriminating against an entire ethnic group is forbidden, religion-based racism is generally considered to be exercising freedom of opinion. It is a kind of dog whistle racism. Wherever we look today, it seems impossible to escape the ever-swelling debate surrounding hate speech and hate crimes. This continues to happen in a worrisome trend on the EU front, and it's relevant to the refugee challenge, especially with the newly emerging risk of another refugee crisis in connection to the conflict in Idlib in war-torn Syria. It is in such a context that fear-mongering about Islam and demonizing Muslims have become more and more worrying. Furious religiosity and furious racism clash in the context of refugee crisis. The ODIHR hate crime reports show to us that anti-Muslim hate crimes are still either underreported or not recorded as Islamophobic hate crimes at all. The fact that police and intelligence officials still refuse to rank violent attacks towards Muslims as anti-Muslim hate crimes independently, but group them within the broad category of xenophobia, means that hostility against Islam is purposefully blurred out. Securitarian policies continue to raise significant problems concerning the collective and institutional dimension of the right to freedom of religion and depart from the principle of equal treatment of religious communities. The question is this: how far can we go in limiting freedom of religion to grant security, or to put it in a better way, what are the best strategies and tools to harmonize the former with the latter? This raises another question, that of state neutrality. A state in all its various manifestations always has distinctive characteristics that derive from the history, culture, and beliefs of the people who live in it. What we therefore need is what one can call an embedded neutrality, or even better, an embedded even-handedness, which acknowledge that the history, culture, traditions, and customs of its populations matter. From this perspective, being even-handed means attaining the optimal level of fairness in the given situation of that country, provided that the bottom line, equal respect for all, is always granted. This is what John Rawls, professor of philosophy of law, calls justice in fairness. Do Muslim individuals and communities get justice in fairness, to use Rawls' definition? Last year, more than 2/3 of anti-Muslim and Islamophobic incidents occurred offline. On a street level, 70%, which represents a 30% rise as compared to the previous year. As far as the online hate speech is concerned, what makes it worse is that social media agencies conduct a haphazard removal process for content. Anti-Muslim hate speech and hate crimes guised as anti-immigrant politics are deeply rooted in cultural incivility. It is clear that legal measures are not enough to combat them. We need to refocus on encouraging public civility and work towards promoting the human good causes in our society. Yes, this means organizing, funding, and implementing. But that is exactly why we are working together. Most of the time, the civility argument is used as a convenient excuse to cover up a dismissal that would happen whether the person in question remained civil or not. How about our civility and culture of otherness? How much of our public civility is based on what we can call the human good, al-fitra, as was referred to by Turkic philosopher al-Farabi 1,000 years ago? As articulated by Richard Park in his work on religious diversity and public civility, the idea of civility can be thought of in two ways. First, the way it's construed by thinkers such as Jürgen Habermas and Peter Berger, who state that in modern liberal democracies, there tends to emerge an expanding political statism on the one hand and a fragmentary relativism of the private sphere on the other hand. The first type of civility is the vertical dimension of civil society that is intended to describe the mediatory function it purportedly fulfills between the state and the self. Second, civility may be understood as having to do with the other or stranger in society. In brief, civil society is distinct from and helps to mediate between the spheres of statecraft and private life. And combating hate crimes through the implementation of the OSCE commitments is the most significant indicator of our civility. What we are witnessing instead is the lack of both vertical and horizontal civility. The end result is incivility. Evidence suggests that hate-motivated victimization often involves an ongoing process of low-level harassment and discrimination. Hate language, under the disguise of freedom of expression, rather abusing freedom of expression, is a sign of spiritual and psychological disease. Whether the hate incidents lead to prosecutions or not, victims want four simple things: to be treated with dignity, to be kept informed about developments in their case, and to ensure that other courses of action are made available to them if the prosecution service chooses not to prosecute. Finally, they want to be believed when reporting discrimination to their employers or hate crimes and incidents to the police. Without that, trust is lost. Last but not least, the country visit reports written by the personal representatives should not be forgotten for some unknown mysterious reasons. During my mandate, together with Rabbi Andrew Baker, I've made 4 official country visits, organized and coordinated by the various respective chairmanships and the ODIHR. Yet only 1 report has been published in the last 3 years. I take the opportunity to thank the Swedish government for endorsing our respective reports on anti-Semitism and on intolerance and discrimination against Muslims, albeit after some updates provided by the state institutes. Before I raise my case, I would also like to remind the participating states that the country visits by personal representatives are ideally about identifying good practices. It is beyond my understanding how some countries think this can be achieved if they postpone, delay, or decline such visit indefinitely, which so far has been the case with some member states. We need to get serious and sincere. I also look forward to the publication of the ODIHR guidelines on security for Muslims. My final message is to Muslim communities in the OSCE region. Stop being a victim and start being the actor of your destiny by helping build a more civilized and non-violent society which acts against racism and xenophobia. Promoting a culture of public civility can help us to create a culture of racism and xenophobia. Promoting culture of public civility in the form of hospitality without destroying each other's contribution, as mentioned by Dr. Siljak. Civility, hospitality, and responsibility for structural inclusion, as mentioned by Dr. Wack. Finally, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Rabbi Baker and Professor Martinez, for their great cooperation in our joint work for a peaceful public service. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. We will now turn to the speakers list, which will be displayed on the screen as it has been in previous sessions. Please keep comments brief and to the point, preferably first listing recommendations. We will have about 2 minutes for interventions. Criticism is welcome, but should be constructive. Participants are not encouraged to read lengthy prepared statements, as I have been doing throughout my moderation, but rather to submit the documents to the Document Distribution Center, which will distribute them to all participants. And finally, as per rules of procedure of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, a representative raising a point of order may not speak on the substance of the matter under discussion. With that, we will turn to the speakers list and the first speaker. The first speaker has the floor.
The three issues which I discuss are Halki Seminary, confiscation of property, and interference in the internal affairs of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. We ask again for the reopening of the Halki Seminary. The Turkish government forced the Halki Seminary to close in 1971, and it is still closed despite repeated requests to reopen by world leaders and even by the Muslim president of the Religious Affairs Directorate. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom in its 2018 report states that the U.S. government should press the Turkish government to fulfill private and public promises that the Greek Orthodox Halki Seminary will be reopened. 2, we ask for the 2011 decree promising a return of confiscated property be reopened and administered fairly. In 1936, the Ecumenical Patriarchate and its institutions owned 8,000 parcels. Today, that number is down to 500, mostly churches and other non-income producing property. The property has been lost through the years due to overt Turkish government decrees and confiscatory taxes in violation of Turkey's obligations under the Treaty of Lausanne. The Turkish government continues to delay the election of minority foundation board members for the few parcels that have been returned, and the present foundation system for the management of such property is not manageable. And 3, interference in the internal affairs of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Local Turkish law requiring ecumenical patriarchs and the hierarchs who elect them to be Turkish citizens should be rescinded. The ministry of the Ecumenical Patriarchate is worldwide. The Order of St. Andrew asks again
Sir, may I
that the
kindly
government
ask you
of
to
Turkey
conclude?
correct these and other examples of blatant religious discrimination.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you very much. Our statement is about the discrimination treatment of Chinese members of the Church of Almighty God in the OSCE space, and more particularly in the EU. France, Switzerland, Belgium, and the Netherlands are indeed the EU countries which massively reject the applications for asylum of these foreign believers, disregarding the high risk of arrest, torture, and imprisonment for years when deported back to China. Considering that the discriminatory treatment of applications for asylum introduced by members of the Church of Almighty God in a number of European countries is based either on ignorance about that community or the fake news spread by the Chinese Communist Party to discredit them, considering that thousands of members of the Church of Almighty God are in prison in China, considering that over 1,700 members of this movement have been denied political asylum and are under threat of being sent back to their country where they were persecuted, we recommend to the state agencies of the European states dealing with applications for asylum from this religious community to visit our online database of religious prisoners around the world, in which we have documented 760 cases of prisoners of the Church of Almighty God, to consult the research works of American and European scholars in religious studies on the website of the CHESNUR, and to consult the online submissions of the numerous NGOs to the upcoming UPR of China later this year, and the Prussia tortured to death, before taking a meaningful decision concerning the applications for political asylum of those people.
May I kindly ask the speaker to conclude?
These brochures can be provided here at the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. We are nearing the end of 2018, and by now we have seen several reports addressing the status of freedom of religion or belief, or FORB, in the world. The general picture is quite grim. Vulnerable groups are still targeted, persecuted, harassed, deprived of their most basic rights and freedoms. Victims of such violations are both believers and non-believers. Some reports, however, present signs of hope, as violations are more likely to be reported and addressed. Freedom of religion protects not only individuals, but also the religious organizations that make faith communities possible. We do not believe that human law has a right to interfere in prescribing rules of worship or to dictate forms for public or private devotion. FORB violations, however, are not perpetrated just by state actors or violent groups. Often, dominant faith groups or state religions are those who directly or indirectly encourage religious discrimination. If you want your religious beliefs to be protected, you must protect religious beliefs that fundamentally differ from your own. Centuries of sectarian conflict have shown that such attitudes degrade the freedom of both. The way to ensure one's own freedom is to ensure freedom to everyone. As Jan Figel, European Commission Special Envoy for the promotion of FORB outside of the European Union, recently put it, religious leaders need to embrace and apply the principles of religious social responsibility. As a global church, and because of its history, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has a special commitment to religious freedom. For nearly 200 years, Mormon leaders have taught the importance of religious freedom for everyone. Our article of faith says, "We claim the privilege of worshiping Almighty God according to the dictates of our own conscience and allow all men the same privilege, let them worship how, where, or what they may." It is our hope and prayer that participating states, civil society, religious leaders, and all people of goodwill will embrace these principles, protect religious freedom for all, and work towards
May I kindly
a more
ask the speaker to conclude?
tolerant society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Mrs. Moderator. While still some countries at the OSCE region are on their unavoidable way to recognize their need of protection of the Scientology religion, it is increasingly recognized under UN and OSCE standards in states such as Spain, Sweden, USA, Portugal, Macedonia, Croatia, and many other courts like the UK, Italy, Germany, and even the European Court of Human Rights. We therefore recommend the Russian Federation, Hungary, and the EU as a whole to come forward on this protection of freedom of religion for all and no discrimination. In this regard, we recommend Russia to encourage a constructive dialogue with our church starting here in our next site event, to abide by the European Convention on Human Rights, the OSCE Helsinki Accords, and the UN Bill of Rights, to ensure the full prohibition of the use of electrical impulses and physical and psychological threats on citizens, to release all 4 Scientologists who are suffering since 14 months pre-trial detention for their beliefs, and review and correct the use of the extremist law so that no one can abuse it to persecute religious groups per se. And we recommend Hungarian authorities to engage also in direct dialogue with Scientology to fully clear any and all questions. 2, to abide by the Constitution's protection of freedom of religion or belief, ceasing any and all discrimination and harassment perpetrated by some civil servants. And 3, to stop every violation of the right to privacy of Scientologists and others by undue use of laws to violate the rights they are meant to protect. In this year, where we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, these recommendations are not anymore a suggestion. This is something that has to become a fact. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you. Recommendations for participating states, OSCE institutions, and field operations and civil society could include to monitor and analyze in concrete terms violations of everyone's freedom of religion or belief and the intellect freedoms of expression, assembly, and association, including the targeting by some participating states of women exercising these freedoms. To insist, in line with the Human Dimension commitments, that the most effective challenge to intolerance and discrimination is to fully implement those commitments, and to use tools such as the OSCE Venice Commission Joint Guidelines on the Legal Personality of Original Belief Communities, on the freedom of association, on the review of legislation affecting freedom of original belief, and on the freedom of peaceful assembly, and on the protection of human rights defenders. Last July, ODIHR Director Gisela Dutter quite rightly noted that the right to freedom of original belief is a universal human right which applies to all, men and women, believers or non-believers, citizens and residents, asylum seekers, migrants and refugees. That universality is indispensable. Among far too many participating states violating their commitments, Turkmenistan has repeatedly jailed Muslims who meet together to study their faith, sentencing them to long labor camp terms in prison camps where they suffer torture and death. And from January, the regime started jailing for periods of between 1 and 2 years Jehovah's Witness conscientious objectors to military service, 9 having been jailed from January up until August. The intersectional approach to tackling all forms of discrimination and intolerance is essential, as our introducer, Dr. Rogue, has recommended. My full statement is on the document distribution send system. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you. We wish to share with the OSCE our deep concern about violation of the right to freedom of religion or belief in the Russian Federation, and our insistence and hope that the Russian government will show greater respect for its international legal human rights obligation in this area. There is abundant objective, empirical evidence of major state violations of the right to freedom of religion or belief and of an associated trend, an increasingly dangerous atmosphere of religious intolerance regarding minority faiths, including the Jehovah's Witnesses, members of the Church of Scientology, Hindus, evangelical Christians, Muslims, followers of Said Nursi, the Falun Gong practitioners, and others. Regrettably, Russia has moved into the vanguard of authoritarian states that infringe of the freedom of religion and conscience, fundamental human rights without which equality before the law and democracy are impossible. Russia's illegal restrictions on the right to freedom of religion or belief, while violating human rights and rule of law principles, are creating conflict and instability in the society. Muslim communities and others have come under pressure from anti-terrorism legislation and practices. In the spirit of the Moscow Helsinki Group and other brave and pioneering human rights organizations, we seek not simply to criticize, but also to establish dialogue about these problems and to assist the Russian government to meet its human rights obligation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I have the honor of making this statement on behalf of the EU, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, Albania, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Moldova, and Andorra. Combating discrimination and all forms of intolerance are among the EU's priorities, both in terms of its domestic internal policy and its foreign and international cooperation policy, including at the OSCE. Our main recommendations are as follows: to systematically condemn calls to hatred, whoever they be made by, whatever their reasons, and whoever the targets, and to encourage reporting of hate crimes. Secondly, to actively cooperate with ODIHR to prevent and combat all forms of intolerance, in particular by contributing to its statistics on hate crimes. Thirdly, to maintain an inclusive approach for fighting against intolerance and discriminations based on the universality of human rights and the fight against all forms of discrimination without distinction. To make sure that the OSCE's activities in the field of the fight against intolerance and discriminations reaffirm our cohesion on the basis of common principles, including the fight against all forms of intolerance and on the basis of the equal dignity between all human beings with no exception. To encourage better articulation of the work done by the various personal representatives of the presidency, as well as with ODIHR, in the framework of an inclusive approach to ensure better coherence and efficiency in the fight against intolerance. The fight against all forms of discrimination and the promotion of tolerance is complex, so we must fight against all forms of discrimination. And in 2007 in Madrid, member states admitted that various forms of intolerance have specificities, but At the same time, it is important to endorse a comprehensive approach and to take into account cross-cutting questions in order to effectively combat all forms of discrimination. This is the approach enshrined in our common commitments within the OSCE that the EU will continue to advocate. Instead of giving in to the temptation to segment our common commitments, participating states should join efforts in order to better fight discriminations in all their forms and to collectively act to tackle the social, economic and political causes of the rising tide of violence and intolerance. The full statement will be available on the website of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. For this session, Canada offers 3 recommendations. 1, that the OSCE participating states continue to advance freedom of religion or belief, both domestically and internationally, in an effort to ensure greater inclusion and respect for individuals and communities of all faiths and beliefs. Secondly, that the OSCE and ODIHR continue to mobilize respect for the right of freedom of religion or belief as a positive approach for strengthening social cohesion, reinforcing public trust, and reconciling respect for human rights as a means of promoting national security and enhancing public safety. Thirdly, that the OSCE participating states do their utmost to ensure that legislation pertaining to registration of religious organizations embraces and upholds the principles of Article 18 of the ICCPR, and that legislation is not used to interfere with, obstruct, or otherwise curtail the activities of religious communities. Moderator, in Canada, my government is committed to striving to ensure that everyone in our society is respected and included, and is committed to creating space for further discussion and learning on important issues related to freedom of religion or belief. We are all the more concerned with the rise of new and resurgent forms of religious discrimination in the OSCE region, oft rooted in the misguided belief that diversity must be seen as a threat. According to the Pew Research Center, restrictions on religion have been on the rise in recent years, with devastating effects on both individuals and communities of all faiths, of all beliefs and non-beliefs. This has taken the form of direct targeting of specific groups, such as is the case for so-called non-traditional religions in Russia. It has also taken the indirect form in the upswing of cynical instrumentalization of the fear of difference for populist political ends.
May I kindly ask the speaker to conclude?
I would just conclude by quoting the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Dr. Ahmed Shahid. The enjoyment of the full exercise of the freedom of religion or belief is necessary through positive policy measures, including in the areas of education, religious literacy, media, civil society development, and state cooperation with religious leaders and communities to bring about a culture where pluralism and diversity is celebrated rather than feared. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
It's an honor to be with you here today to represent the United States. We commend the Italian chairmanship for hosting the January conference on the fight against anti-Semitism. And taking responsibility means taking action. There's no justification for anti-Semitism ever. Last week, I led a group from the State Department with Ambassador Kozak to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and later this week, I'll visit Auschwitz and Birkenau, places of absolute horror, but places we must never forget. Despite the lessons that we all should have learned, anti-Semitism is unfortunately not history. It's unfortunately, again, a present reality. We are alarmed at the spread of extremist anti-Semitic ideologies. Governments everywhere must condemn anti-Semitism whenever it arises. We urge all governments to embrace the working definition of anti-Semitism. It's also necessary that governments partner with civil society. My government supports the work of ODIHR Hate Crimes Unit and its efforts to collect comprehensive data. We need governments to report the data diligently. And we commend ODIHR's Turning Words into Actions to Address Anti-Semitism project. It continues to have an impact, and we want to see it continue. We also urge participating states to better utilize OSCE tolerance instruments to put our common commitments into practice. The United States remains deeply committed to working around the world to expand religious freedom for everybody, everywhere. We hosted the first ever ministerial on religious freedom in July, and 84 countries participated. We will host a second ministerial on religious freedom next year in Washington as we continue to pursue this universal, basic human right. We're asking other nations to host regional religious freedom events to pursue this topic in their region and their efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Madam Chairperson, distinguished colleagues, in spite of the great number of specialized commitments adopted in the OSCE, combating religious intolerance, racism, xenophobia, and aggressive nationalism still remain one of the most relevant challenges for our organization. Today, followers of the leading international religions are under threat. One reason for this is the rise to absolutism and arbitrary interpretation of the notion of tolerance that ensures protection only for the rights of religious minorities, artificially pushing Christianity out to the sidelines of public life, banning religious symbols, aggressive atheism, desecration of holy sites, and taking over Russian Orthodox churches, persecution of clergy, and even their murder have, in many countries of the OSCE, become an everyday occurrence, unfortunately. Too many people underestimate the danger of driving out Christianity out of public life. Secular values cannot fill the vacuum. This vacuum is often filled by pseudo-religions and even religious doctrines which are extremism. The situation in Ukraine is extremely alarming. Authorities condone the far-right radicals who are taking over Ukrainian Orthodox churches, ignoring the violence perpetrated against clergy and worshippers. These attempts are to curtail the leading religions in Ukraine, to break up the church. The autocephalous status of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which the church itself has never claimed for itself, leads to further rifts in society. The migration crisis in Europe has also provoked attitudes against anti-Muslims and anti-migrants. Mosques and religious symbols are desecrated. We have seen that social networks are also used to target religions, and certain religions are identified with terrorism. In this context, implementing the OSCE's Basel Ministerial Declaration from 2014 on elaborating specific statements on combating intolerance and discrimination against Christians and Muslims should be the guideline for the Italian chairmanship in Milan. The full text of my statement of the Russian delegation will be distributed through the Secretariat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We align ourselves with the statement delivered on behalf of the EU, but let me have some remarks in my national capacity. The Hungarian government uses all available means to promote the fulfillment of freedom of religion or belief and attaches great importance to the protection of religious communities in Hungary and outside, especially in crisis areas. The Hungarian response to the migration and other humanitarian crises consists of the support of persecuted communities on the spot, and our view is the strengthening of the freedom of religion provides one of the basic requirements for the peaceful and prosperous survival of communities living in a crisis zone. Unfortunately, it is rarely mentioned in international discourse nowadays, but the most persecuted religious community worldwide is the Christians, and they are among the most vulnerable groups in several regions of the world. It is important also to highlight that while Hungary is a secular state, it is proud of its Christian roots. I would also like to point out that the Hungarian government was the first to set up a special administrative unit dedicated providing aid to minorities persecuted because of their religion, and what is important, it is also launched a specific humanitarian program with the same purpose under the name Hungary Helps. The program has 3 different pillars. We are distributing and providing humanitarian emergency aid. We have reconstruction projects, and also the Hungarian government launched a scholarship program for persecuted, discriminated, and threatened young Christians. In addition to being active in international organizations and having an intensive work relationship with international faith-based charity organizations, we are organizing international conferences. For example, in last October, we had the first World Consultation on Christian persecution with more than 400 participants, politicians, leaders of Eastern churches, and also representatives of numerous NGOs. Mr. Martinez, who became later...
May I kindly ask the speaker to conclude?
Just one thing. Based on the discussion at the US-initiated and hosted ministerial conference on religious freedom held in July, and on the recommendation of the State Department, we are planning to organize this meeting again next year. The full statement will be distributed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Ms. President. I would like to touch upon the issue of refugees from religious persecution in China. So we all know that there is a big difference between migrants and refugees, and I perfectly understand challenges that the authorities of recipient countries are forcing to distinguish between those who are in imminent danger and those who are pretending. I can tell countless stories of people who flee severe religious persecution in China, though I will focus quickly on members of new Christian group called the Church of Almighty God. This church is one of the largest and fastest growing religious groups in China, and this is exactly why they are severely persecuted. Any member identified by the Chinese authorities would be sent to jail. Most of them, they will be tortured. They will be sent to education camps, and once released, will be kept under watch and eventually put in jail again if they would not agree to cooperate with Chinese authorities and renounce their faith. Cases of suspect organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience of this church have also been reported. So most members of this church would flee their country only and when they have the confirmed information that their arrest is imminent. So they do not flee to seek out jobs or get financial or economic benefits. On August 31st, despite protests by the Red Cross and the German Evangelical Lutheran Church and several NGOs, a member of this church, Sister Zhao, was deported back from China to China from Germany. She has disappeared in China, and her whereabouts are unknown ever since. My pleading today to the representatives of the participating states is, please hear and remember the name of the Church of Almighty God. Please carry out serious research about this group. Do not believe what Chinese media and Western media that copy them are saying, but read reliable information from independent NGOs and academic sources. China spares no effort and financial means to persuade us.
May I kindly ask the speaker to conclude?
So perhaps we cannot change the politics in China, but there is a moral and legal obligation for the member states to protect the people who are in imminent danger. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you. My name is Gözde Taşkaya, and this is my third year here in the HDIM. And in these 3 years, a lot of things has changed in Austria, but unfortunately not for the good. Meanwhile, we have an Islam law which, for example, forbids only Muslims to receive funding from abroad. We have face veiling ban come into force and much more, like the endless discussions about banning the headscarf in different areas and sectors. This time it is about a veil ban that should apply to girls in the kindergarten, but actually there are no kids in the kindergarten wearing veils. So it's all about populism and gaining votes on the back of minorities, in this case especially Muslim women and children. Once we had the case where Austrian newspaper leaked that the results of a study which was about Islamic kindergarten and which was commissioned by the Integration Ministry had come out with significant changes. And the newspaper pointed out that these changes were carried out by public officials working in the Integration Ministry. Another story. On a Friday, right before the Friday prayer in the fasting and holy month of Ramadan, the government stages a big press conference announcing that the closure of some mosques. Our vice-chancellor of Austria said that this was just the beginning in order to fight political Islam. But the thing is, the mosques were closed because they didn't comply with legal requirements on the new Islam law. But shortly after they met the requirements, they opened up again. So this was nothing but a written and played scenario. But what effect does this have? A rise in hate and hate crimes, verbal and physical attacks, racism and discrimination against Muslims. The result is that Islamophobia has reached the middle of society. But not only Islamophobia, hate towards refugees and against people of color in general. Instead of setting
May I kindly ask the speaker to conclude?
Yes. Instead of setting a focus on fighting racism and discrimination, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Integration said that these experiences of discrimination simply are a part of life and growing up, and we have to try to deal with it.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Moderator. My name is Aisha Elkilic. I'm the president of Think Out, a Belgium-based non-profit organization, a think tank. We wouldn't be here today if the political system of OSCE member states worked perfectly. We wouldn't be here if the judicial system of a country of the OSCE worked perfectly. For example, if hate crimes against Muslims would effectively be prosecuted and brought in front of the court. The role of politicians regarding hate crimes cannot be underestimated, especially in the period before the elections, such as the case in Belgium, which will hold regional elections on the 14th of October. To get electoral gain, the politicians force their opinions about the topics concerning Muslims and migrants. In the past, this anti-Muslim rhetoric was only used by far-right parties. We notice that other classical parties, who are supposed to be more democratic, use the same rhetoric to gain votes. This will lead to normalization of racist and dangerous thoughts. In Belgium, this normalization has led to the creation of a student organization with the main goal to eliminate everyone of the community who doesn't fit in their perfect image of European citizen. These students defend dangerous thoughts strengthened by the normalization of political far-right and hate speeches both online and offline. That's why it's important and crucial that we form a civil front against anti-Muslim rhetoric. The current political climate shows symptoms with negative effects. We have seen the Interpol's latest terror report that right-wing and left-wing separatist terrorists is in the rise. These terrorist groups have committed the most crimes in 2017. We have to stand up against the minimalization of racism. Otherwise, this will cause more hate, leading to certain dangerous groups of units like students who express their hate against Muslims, Jews, women, migrants, and so on. The goal of these dangerous groups...
May I kindly ask the speaker to conclude?
Thank you. The full text will be will be spread. The recommendation of Think Out is to form a civil front to cooperate instead of searching confrontation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Madam Moderator, I'm Ali Husseinoğlu. Muslims of different ethnic origins living in Greece, numbering around 1 million, have a variety of problems enjoying their religious rights. For those living outside Western Thrace region, there is no single official mosque. There is no Islamic cemetery as well. Many Muslims, they also face discrimination based on their ethnic, cultural, and religious identities. They are frequently targeted and physically, verbally abused, particularly by members of the ultranationalist groups. Golden Dawn is one of the most prominent political fronts that depicts anti-Islam and racist attitudes at different platforms, including the European Parliament and the Hellenic Parliament. With the same token, even those Muslim converts of ethnic Greek origin do not feel themselves comfortable enough to show their religious affiliation in public spheres due to the possibility of stigmatization and otherization. Also, some prominent figures of the Greek church use a clear Islamophobic discourse while commenting issues of Muslims in Greece. From time to time, Muslims of ethnic Turkish origin in Western Thrace, they face Islamophobia in their everyday lives. Smashing of windows, defamation of mosque walls, destruction of tombstones inside Muslim cemeteries are some of their actions. Furthermore, necessary works have not been started yet at the Çelebi Sultan Mosque in the city of Didimotiho. Even masjids owned and functioned by members of the Muslim Turkish minority living permanently outside Western Thrace have recently been closed, and no right has been given yet to the place of worship. So we urge Greece to respect religious rights of Muslims across the country, discourage and prevent any physical and verbal Islamophobic attack, introduce new legislative measures and mechanisms of monitoring to combat effectively with Islamophobia in Greece, with close collaboration with Muslims in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. This year, Azerbaijan Republic celebrates 10th year of anniversary of the Baku process. Baku process is an initiative directed to promote interreligious and intercultural dialogue. It was initiated by the President of the Republic of Azerbaijan in the Conference of Ministers of Culture of the Council of Europe member states. In 2008, it came into existence. In September 2010, the President of the Republic of Azerbaijan, in his speech delivered in the 65th session of the United Nations General Assembly, declared that Azerbaijan will host World Intercultural Dialogue Forum. It calls the transformation of Baku process from regional initiative into global movement. In accordance with this idea, there were 4 World Forums of Intercultural Dialogue in 2011, in 2013, in 2015, and in 2017. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres highly appreciated the role of Baku process in the development of dialogue between cultures. The report Promotion on a Culture of Peace and Interreligious and Intercultural Dialogue, Understanding and Cooperation for Peace, submitted by the Secretary General of the United Nations to the General Assembly in October 2017 says, the World Forum on Intercultural Dialogue, organized by the government of Azerbaijan in cooperation with UNESCO, Alliance of Civilization, United Nations World Tourism Organization, the Council of Europe, and Islamic Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, has established itself as a key global platform for promoting intercultural dialogue. Within the framework of this event, Azerbaijan hosted many intercultural, interreligious events. Among them, I would like to note a Summit of Religious Leaders in 2010, Baku International Humanitarian Forum, and this year I would like to tell you that Azerbaijan will host the next, the 7th Forum on Intercultural and Interreligious Dialogue. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to our next speaker.
My organization, the Russian School Defense Staff, combats the ethno-focused government in Latvia to defend the Russian speakers in Latvia. No one helps us. The European Union cannot criticize Latvia because that would be tantamount to the criticism of the EU itself. They understood who they took in as members in 2014. The ethnocentric tendencies in Latvia were clear back then even. We can only hope for the assistance from international organizations. At the end of August, the UN Commission on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination gave some recommendations to Latvia that points to all of the issues that we're concerned with. Unfortunately, Latvia never implemented the recommendations of the UN, and we have no reason to believe that they're going to implement these recommendations now, because this will stand in the way of building the ethnocentric government in Latvia. I would like to appeal to the OSCE to join the efforts of the UN Commission on the elimination of racial discrimination. First of all, to support them, and secondly, I would like to invite the High Commissioner of the OSCE on National Minorities and the OSCE High Commissioner on Combating Discrimination to focus on the situation in Latvia and to visit Latvia to support us and to listen to our problems. This Saturday, there will be a major meeting to support Russian schools, and I would like to ask the OSCE participants and representatives to come to this meeting and to support us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Здравствуйте, дамы и господа.
Good morning. Our organization deals with the monitoring of extremism in Eastern Europe and in Belarus. We note with satisfaction that in Belarus, we are the only country in the post-Soviet space where we do not have inter-ethnic or inter-religious conflicts or disputes with neighboring states. But extremism is still very much a challenge, first and foremost with regard to the conflict in neighboring Ukraine. Some nationalist organizations are taking advantage of the conflict and are saying that they are the ones who have inherited the extremist views after the Second World War and have been integrated into the armed forces of Ukraine. These structures are also trying to agitate in Belarus.
The delegation of Canada.
Just a point of order, Madam Moderator. I'm sorry to interrupt, but and I do believe that everybody has the right to use this meeting to speak to the very important issues that concern them. But we've had 2 speakers in a row that are not talking about the topic of this morning's session. And I'm thinking that we should probably retain our practice that has been used in the other sessions so far in asking those who do not have a presentation to give directly to the item at hand, that they forego their turn and let others who do want to speak to the issue of the day take the floor. Thank you.
I think I was really talking on topic of today's meeting, and may I continue?
Thank you very much for raising the point of order. We only accept points of order on the procedure, so we'll let the speaker finish. Was his time over?
No.
Okay. Finish the time.
Я могу продолжать?
May I continue?
Могу.
Okay. Well,
Say to the topic of the session. Please, the speaker can finish his minute.
Значит, я хотел...
I will go on the topic here. So I wanted to say the following. These nationalist organizations, unfortunately, are also active in Belarus. And today, 10 of our citizens are serving in the so-called Azov regiment. Their symbolism is something which points to Nazism. It was used by the SS during the Second World War. It is linked with the wolf. Often they also use the mass media, which is being supported by some democratic countries. The Belsat and Hartia sites, which the head chief complained about recently.
Государство пересмотреть свои отношения с данными ресурсами и не допускать пропаганды нацизма в своей деятельности.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Уважаемые коллеги,
Colleagues, I am representing the Information Group of Crimes Against the Persons, and I'd like to draw attention to the crimes suffered by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, in particular in the media because of the Moscow Patriarchy. In 2014, out of 33
I also take this opportunity to remind speakers to please speak on the topic of the session. The topic of the session being tolerance and non-discrimination, including combating anti-Semitism, combating intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief, including Christians, Muslims, and members of other religions.
данное место устраивает?
Is this place all right? I apologize, but given that I had to change place, I would like to request an extra 30 seconds. Since 2014, and the start of the civil conflict in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been linked with all of the Ukrainian society and appeal to all parties to refrain from violence. Unlike other religious organizations in Ukraine, such as other patriarchies and churches who have actively cooperated with far-right and nationalistic organizations. As a consequence, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in 2014 and 2015 suffered harassment by the nationalists. There were 21 churches that were seized. There were cases of arson and the destruction by artillery in the area of Donbass. There were a number of clergymen who died, and many of them were wounded. However, so far, and what's more, the government is also joining in the persecution. We are seeing how the Verkhovnaya Rada is considering banning the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and interfering in the religious life of the country. The Ukrainian security services have carried out raids and exercised pressure on priests and on journalists covering the offences committed against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been accused of stirring up discord and anti-governmental activities. I will give my statement in full to the Secretariat.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Microphone, please, for the speaker.
Thank you. My statement is about religion-based refugees come from China to OSCE participating states. In 2018, three alarming developments worsened the situation of religious liberty in China. First, on February 1, 2018, a new and more restrictive law of religion came into force in China, affecting particularly Christian house churches. Second, in 2018, we are witnessing a massive crackdown on Uyghurs in Xinjiang, which is causing many refugees to flee from China to OSCE participating states. And third, we saw a growing repression of groups labeled as Seijiao, or translated as evil cults, but in fact meaning heterodox teachings, particularly from the Church of Almighty God and Falun Gong. What are the problems in the OSCE participating states of this situation? It's the influx of refugees from China, particularly Uyghur Muslims in Central Asian republics, and members of Church of Almighty God in Western Europe. In some countries, and we want to commend Canada and Sweden for their policy of welcoming refugees from China, and Italy for partnering with scholars for a fair assessment of religious situation in China, but in many other countries, refugees are not welcome and some have been deported to China. So our recommendation is to consider the situation of religion-based refugees in China because they really risk their life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
According to through anti-blasphemy laws, Muslim countries have successfully imposed Sharia law on Muslim countries. The SEBB case is well known. This was a Pakistani Christian who was accused of having drunk water from a well with a glass that was reserved for Muslims. And because she, as an impure Christian, was not allowed to drink from that glass. And when she asked what the Prophet Muhammad had done for the world in positive terms, she was sentenced to death and accused of blasphemy. Thanks to international organizations, she has so far escaped the death sentence, but should she be released from prison, she would doubtlessly be killed by the masses. A Christian can constantly be accused of blasphemy just because they do not convert to Islam. And it appears that Christians say the Prophet was an impostor just because they do not share the same faith. And often, in 2015, President al-Sisi of Egypt deplored that 1,600,000,000 people can want to kill the remaining citizens of the world, and he deplored that Islam should be the source of concern, destruction, and killing throughout the world. And as a consequence, he had an impact on religion. We would and try to bring about a religious religion, and we would like to contribute to that religion by urging Muslims to think about these issues. How can a non-Muslim live in a Muslim country without being blasphemous when they do not convert to Islamic faith. I have a point of order, Madam Moderator. Why did you move a Russian-speaking speaker and not this speaker?
To conclude, thank you very much. I'm also going to ask, so please turn your microphone off, sir. I'm also going to ask civil society to please sit at the civil society sets. I didn't want to interrupt your time, but you're at media, and then we have the NHRI over there. So please kindly, if you're speaking on behalf of civil society, sit at the civil society seats. Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor to the next speaker now.
Merci.
Thank you, moderator. As a multicultural society and multi-religious society, Switzerland is devoted to promoting multi-ethnic and multi-religious society for the sake of multicultural society promotion. With regard to this issue, we believe that our citizens are guaranteed equal participation in social political life, which promotes the well-being and stability of the entire country. And in this connection, civil society, interreligious councils, religious leaders, politicians, men and women in the media play a crucial role in promoting dialogue with all of these participants. Are Switzerland's efforts internationally with regard to our foreign policy and nationally as well. For example, we have strengthened dialogue between the representatives of Muslim communities in Switzerland working with the media in order to promote and foster their mutual understanding and to avoid some subjective representation of them in Switzerland. What's more, in the framework of our chairmanship of the International Alliance for the Holocaust Remembrance for 2017-2018, we have led international efforts to counter any efforts to distort and not only to deny the Holocaust. And in conclusion, each citizen can and must contribute to efforts for non-discrimination, and it is up to political decision makers and to states to create the conditions conducive to combat all forms of intolerance and discrimination efficiently and sustainably. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Good morning. Norway has established a position of Special Envoy of Freedom of Religion or Belief, which is a post that I try to fill at the moment. I just want to touch on a few of the important topics of this session with the following recommendations. For participating states to monitor intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief, including anti-Semitic, anti-Islamic, and all other discriminatory attitudes closely, and when publicly expressed, to address them firmly in accordance with OSCE and other international human rights commitments. And secondly, in adopting strategies to combat intolerance and discrimination, hate speech, and other forms of harassment, to draw on ODIHR's expertise and include measures to train law enforcement, prosecution, and the judiciary in rights-compliant responses to hate crime. Our region has seen recurring incidents of hate speech, of harassment of Jews and Jewish property, of neo-Nazis marching in our streets. As history has demonstrated, we must not allow these forces of intolerance and discrimination to define our societies. Norway has a plan of action that sets out our strategy against anti-Semitism. Several ministries and government agencies work together in implementing the action plan, with a particular emphasis on prevention and education. Surveys show a decrease in this prejudice in Norway. Still, challenges remain. The OSCE has an important part to play in confronting intolerance and discrimination internationally. Its executive structures can assist participating states. Particularly relevant are ODIHR through its work on tolerance and non-discrimination, and the RFOM in its efforts to counter hate speech in the media and in the field operations in cooperation with their host countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Mr. Konstantin, the National Agency of Ukraine. with regard to fighting discrimination and hatred in Ukraine are important policies. We are going through a very difficult period in time due to the aggression from the Russian Federation. We have seen certain offenses based on hatred. Hate-based crimes in Ukraine have been targeted through our laws. The National Police of Ukraine that I represent is a body that ensures combating hate crimes. We are working with international and NGOs organizations in combating this crime. The National Police has focused on specific staff members who work as watchdogs with regard to hate crimes. Our National Police is also working on upgrading our methods to combat hate crimes. The National Police is actively working on elaborating methodologies and working with international experts. Currently, we're working with experts from ODIHR. We are especially focusing on upgrading the skills of police in combating hate crimes. I also would like to draw your attention to the fact that the National Police provides for everyone's rights, no matter their religious beliefs. And in 2017, in Ukraine, we had over 56,000 of religious events that included over 18 million people. During these religious events, we were able to maintain law and order in spite of the fact irrespective of the religious institutions. And we protected also worshippers and the religious organizations. We support the right of everyone for religious belief and the right for any person or community to choose their religion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the next speaker on the list.
Thank you. My name is Ellen Fantini. I'm the Executive Director of the Observatory on Intolerance and Discrimination Against Christians in Europe. And I will begin with two concrete recommendations to address both hate crimes and intolerance and discrimination against Christians. First, we respectfully remind participating states to continue to improve their efforts on data collection through measures such as increased involvement of civil society, disaggregated data, and development of national action plans. To this end, national points of contact are called upon to collect, maintain, and make public disaggregated data on hate crimes perpetrated against members of different religions in accordance with Ministerial Decision 909. Secondly, we urge participating states to guarantee freedom of religion and belief by protecting the right to manifest those beliefs through expression, speech, association, conscience, and parental rights. In regions both east and west of Vienna, there are recurring hate-motivated incidents and hate crimes against Christians, including murder. Destruction of Christian cemeteries and churches occurs daily in some places. The ODIHR and participating states should avoid taking the position that hate crimes, intolerance, and discrimination against majority religions are somehow less serious than those committed against minority ones. The OSCE commitments apply to majority religions as well. As Professor Martinez noted in his introductory remarks, anti-Christian incidents are often explained away as reflecting modernity or the social malaise, rather than taken as seriously as they should be. Regarding the implementation of OSCE commitments, the Observatory applauds those countries that have improved their data collection and reporting on hate crimes against Christians. However, underreporting and under-recording remain a serious problem. My full remarks are available online. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn the floor over to the next speaker on the list.
Good afternoon. I represent the European Federation for Freedom of Belief. Last year, I concluded my statement in this venue by saying that the European Federation for Freedom of Belief would have kept working on behalf of religious minorities in Europe, and we would have kept working with international organizations and national authorities. That is what we did, and even though we are a European federation, we also focused on other geographic areas like Asia, where Muslims and members of Xiezhao, which means heterodox teachings, often called cults, experience many problems. We organized an international convention, which was accredited by the OSCE, by the Council of Europe, and by the Italian presidency of Republic. We received the support of Her Majesty's government of the United Kingdom when I filed 2 complaints with the United Nations on behalf of victims of religious persecution. We do think that dialogue between minorities and national and international authorities is vital for the improvement of freedom of religion and belief in the world. Her Majesty's government came when I was at the ministerial in the United States. The United States, in fact, is leading an international movement for the improvement of freedom of religion and belief in the world. Unfortunately, not all member states are complying with the international obligations. For this reason, we will keep working on these matters, on these issues, together with other NGOs, and we really hope that rule of law, justice, and human rights will be fully implemented in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Вопрос толерантности.
Tolerance and the fight against anti-Semitism in Turkmenistan is a very pressing issue right now. The government continues an anti-Semitic policy which was begun by the dictator, and now a number of young people who are studying and school pupils come under pressure of radical Islamists or populists who advocate Wahhabism or other radical ideologies and xenophobia, which has an impact on the national minorities in Turkmenistan. Even journalists who have emigrated to Turkmenistan more than 25 years ago are often, when they talk about the dictatorship and corruption in the country, come under pressure on the basis of their religious beliefs. So pseudo-ideas about Jewish conspiracies are touted, and nobody has any intention to do anything about this. But the fact that these ideals are now taking root amongst young people with calls for anti-Semitism coming from abroad is a very dangerous syndrome, which shows that there is a deliberate attempt in the current political and economic conjuncture to manipulate people, and it is the government has held people accountable for their beliefs, in particular Jewish women, and we call for this to cease.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to take the floor. Kyrgyzstan. Freedom of assembly is an essential human right, essential to the functioning of democracies, but is also a key condition for the exercise of other rights. And it is essential to protect human rights and to ensure this is done partly through the HDIM. In Kyrgyzstan, we have multiple ethnicities. It is a multicultural and multi-religious country. Over the last 20 years, the country has seen an increase in the level of religiosity within our country. And in such conditions, attempts to present the country as a sacred one is very difficult. We understand that. But there are secular countries which guarantee equal rights to all confessions and which are successfully developing. And we are troubled by the fact that we hear other countries saying that they will help Muslims and help adopt Sharia principles. So we are seeing an increase in violence against women as a consequence of all this. There are challenges which call for the secular status of Turkmenistan to be dismantled. So we turn to the OSCE to, and in light of the fact that we have a new leadership in the country, we would like to call for assistance in order to develop a new law on religions which should take account of the high principle, which is the freedom of religion. Thank you.
I now turn to the next speaker on the list.
I'm speaking on behalf of Morocco, a Mediterranean partner of the OSCE. In the context of today's topic, I would like to note that Morocco has just held an international conference on the dialogue of cultures and religions from the 10th to 12th of September in Fez, the spiritual capital of Morocco. This conference was a forum where a call was launched for the rapprochement of civilizations, and more dialogue and greater religious dialogue. We call upon protecting religious minorities in the land of Islam, which the Marrakesh Charter is a roadmap against extremism. We were also a founding member of the Alliance of Civilizations. In 2008, Morocco adopted the Uleman's Charter in order to provide a framework for religious worship in schools and religious schools. We are also training imams where these men and women will be working in Africa and Europe in order to advocate a message of peace and tolerance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. In their vital quest to combat intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief, we urge all OSCE participating states who have them to repeal their blasphemy laws. All evidence shows that prohibitions on blasphemy or religious insult encourage intolerance, discrimination, hostility, and can lead to a wide range of human rights abuses. Across the world, there are numerous examples of persecution and discrimination against religious and non-religious minorities and dissenters that come as a result of legislation on religious offense. The UN Special Rapporteur on Free Expression, the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, and the UN Secretary General Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide have all called for blasphemy laws to be repealed globally, as have international instruments specifically written on the subject of combating intolerance and discrimination, such as the Fez and Rabat Plans of Action and the Beirut Declaration. Yet, there are 16 countries in this OSCE region which outlaw blasphemy. Over the past decade, in a number of these, including in Russia, Turkey, Kazakhstan and Greece, these laws have been used to sentence people with imprisonment. You cannot end intolerance based on religion or belief by selectively silencing speech of religious and non-religious people. In some cases, just advocacy of one's belief might be construed or received as a criticism of another's beliefs. That is a small price we pay for protecting freedom of religion or belief, free expression and promotion of mutual understanding for fostering tolerance. We must protect the rights of all individuals to be free from intolerance, discrimination and hate crimes. And we must counter offensive expression through dialogue, counter-speech, education and public debate, not through its criminalization. Next month, Ireland will hold a referendum on removing the anti-blasphemy provision from its constitution. We wholeheartedly hope the people set a good example by voting to approve its removal. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Freedom of religion is one of the core fundamental rights enshrined in the OSCE commitments. Non-implementation of the OSCE commitments by the participating states, including freedom of religion, endangers democratic values and can trigger nationalism and populism. Vulnerable groups such as ethnic and religious minorities are often affected first by such trends. When authorities ignore the existence of these communities, it makes it challenging for minorities to combat the intolerance and discrimination they face, such as in Greece. The right to conduct religious educational activities in the mother tongue of the persons belonging to nations minorities was affirmed as one of the commitments by participating states of the 1990 Copenhagen document. However, Greece failed to undertake its commitments stated above by implementing the law on Muslim preachers, which led to Turkish community children receiving religious lessons in Greek language. Education is one of the areas where the members of the Turkish community are subjected to discrimination. The Turkish community in Western Thrace was granted the right to open its own minority schools by the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne. However, the autonomy of the Turkish community at all levels in education has been undercut throughout years by wide-ranging control of the Ministry of Education and Religious Affairs over the minority schools. The absence of bilingual minority kindergartens for the Turkish minority of Western Thrace remains a crucial obstacle for the minority children's development. We call upon Greece to restore the educational and religious autonomy of the Turkish community of Western Thrace and implement policies in line with the OSCE Hague the recommendations regarding the education rights of national minorities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
My name is Shazana, and I'm the Community Relations Officer for a human rights NGO based in London called CAGE. I wish to address a fundamental concern of how the state is using CVE, known as Prevent in the UK, to separate children from families. Prevent was introduced into UK legislation in 2015, firmly embedding it institutionally and coercing over 500,000 public sector workers to apply it. It is an Islamophobic policy that targets Muslim families and criminalizes their identity. It is based on a pseudoscience, ERG22, that is in itself questionable on validity, ethical application, fairness and transparency. It is important to note the actual study has been withheld from the public under the guise of national security. Britain's leading counter-terrorism officer, Mark Rowley, has admitted that over 100 children have been dragged through the family courts, where often the removal of children from their parents is sought using the risk factors derived from this policy. The Prevent policy is not unique to the UK. It is replicated and rebranded globally as CVE. Prevent is a failed strategy. It has not reduced the threat level, and Prevent has been condemned as a toxic policy by academics, NGOs and MPs, among others. Next week, CAGE will publish a report that provides insight into the human experiences and trauma that has impacted not only individuals, but the entire family structure based on unnecessary state intervention. This coercive approach is having a devastating and damning impact on the relationship between Muslims in the UK and the state. On this basis, we propose the following recommendations. Firstly, we urge the UK government to publish the science behind the Prevent, the ERG, and subject it to peer review. Secondly, stop criminalising families and viewing Muslim citizens as a suspect community, and end Prevent and its global equivalent, CVE. And finally, the rule of law must be upheld in family courts, the rights of families must be protected, and the use of secret evidence in these proceedings must end.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Bonjour, je m'appelle. Hello, Anis Seridi, and I'm speaking on behalf of a French human rights organization that focuses on the fight against racism and repression. Amongst the victims that we come across, there are Muslim women who wear a veil or a headscarf and who are discriminated against in the framework of their professional activities, in particular through the principle of secularism. Secularism was enshrined in the 1905 law in France, and it imposes on public officials to show religious neutrality in the fulfillment of their duties. But this only applies to the public sector, to the civil service, and not to the private sector. Yet, for some time now, we have seen slippages towards its application in the private sector. The Crèche Babylou case is a perfect example. An employee who was wearing the veil was dismissed on the grounds that she did not respect the internal rules for secularism. This has been a resounding case in France because the highest jurisdiction in France, the Court of Cassation, issued two contradictory rulings on this case. Firstly, the court considered that the principle of secularism was not applicable to private sector employees, and that was why the companies or the creches rules were considered to be discriminatory. But then, following a debate in civil society, the Court of Cassation came back on its decision and considered the dismissal to be perfectly justified. It is only because the Human Rights Council decided that this was a religious-based form of discrimination that the Court of Cassation recently decided to seize itself again of this case. That is why I would like to make the following recommendations. First of all, to repeal the August 2016 law, because following this case in August 2016, a law was adopted imposing or allowing employees to impose religiously discriminating rules in their internal rules, and we call for penalties to impose on companies who show discrimination against Muslim employees, and we would like to see veiled women more present in the television and media landscape in order to make their presence more normal and to prevent any friction about their identity, and also to reinforce parallel diplomacy.
Circulated. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Merci, Madame la Modératrice.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I am the spokesperson for IMISCO. International bodies for fighting against discrimination and Islamophobia are well familiar with Islamophobia and its impact on our societies. Unfortunately, though, they do not have the weight to counter the systemic racism which tends to divide citizens according to their religious faith. And governments prefer to be silent about this, but such coyness can be lethal. The institutionalization and the normalization of Islamophobic sentiments is problematic, and we have seen as a consequence that this specific form of hatred is now becoming a political and media form of cult. When a public figure speaks about defending the specificities of European culture, I'm sure that they are not trying to contribute to social cohesion. We have made written recommendations. I would like to wrap up by saying that this trivialization of Islamophobia is also found in the human dimension meetings. We cannot speak here as if we were sat around a coffee table, mixing up concepts such as racism, prejudice, ignorance, and intolerance. By mixing and confusing religion with terrorism, Sharia with violence and criminality, we must, on the contrary, preserve the level of and standard of these meetings. Fundamental rights and the defense thereof must be our main preoccupation here. Human idiocy shall not prevent us from working with ODIHR in order to promote living together, social mutual understanding and mutual respect. Participating states have the necessary experience to counter racism and hatred, and this platform can provide us with the tools to do so, and IMISCO and its partners are prepared to cooperate for this purpose. Thank you.
May I kindly ask the next speaker on the list to take the floor?
The OIC countries have been actively and constructively involved at different levels to promote universal human rights values for all without discrimination on any grounds. In line with our commitment to human rights, the OIC established its Human Rights Commission that operates in an independent and transparent manner to advise member states on all issues of human rights concerns. We in the OIC consider that the culture of solidarity and tolerance constitutes the basis of the struggle against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, including religious intolerance. This culture requires member states to introduce adequate protection against acts of hate crimes, hate speech, discrimination, and intimidation, and coercion resulting from defamation and negative stereotyping of religions and incitement to religious hatred. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation is concerned over increased incidents of anti-Muslim attacks and sentiments. We believe that such manifestations of religious hatred and intolerance are against the spirit of cooperation and peaceful coexistence. They are also impediments to the promotion and protection of human rights. The OIC, on its part, forthrightly denounces the ideological narratives of all terrorist and extremist groups using religion, ideology, or cultural superiority to legitimize their violent and manipulative acts. The Human Rights Council Resolution 1618 presents a global consensus on how to effectively combat negative stereotyping, incitement to hatred, discrimination, and violence against persons based on religions or belief. This resolution provides an action plan for the member states to combat the ever-increasing instances of Islamophobia, intolerance, negative stereotyping, stigmatization, discrimination, and violence all over the world. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Dankeschön, Frau Moderatorin. Wir haben 3 konkrete Empfehlungen.
Thank you very much, moderator. I have 3 specific recommendations. Firstly, religious or ethnic profiling still exists in Germany, so we must have better training for the police force on this topic. The German administrations and the Office of Statistics have a great deal of data on Muslim immigrants, and together with this enormous amount of information is the number, for example, of Muslim children is also provided to the Office of Youth Affairs. And all of this is sometimes also used in penitentiary institutions. These are not necessarily statistics that are made public. I think in order to combat discrimination and intolerance, that it would be a good idea to have access to some of this information. Since January of 2017, beyond anti-Semitic offenses, anti-Christian or anti-Muslim offenses have been considered to be political offenses. Now, some have talked about a drop in politically motivated crimes, but in 2017, 994, of which 54 acts of violence were committed by people from the far right, and many of these crimes have been against Muslims. Now, seeing all of this, we do realize that it is necessary to undertake police and law enforcement measures to protect Muslim institutions as well as the Muslim community. Thank you.
I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. My name is Musa Acar. I'm a former member of the board of the Union of European Turkish Democrats Switzerland. As announced last year, we are here today to present the results of the first poll amongst the Muslim population in Switzerland regarding their anti-Muslim racism, hate crime, and Islamophobic experiences. 35% of the Muslims testify that they experience hate crime in Switzerland. 53% say that they know other Muslims having experienced hate crime. 73% are sure that this experience is because of their religion. 16% are not sure and say their religion is the probable cause. 5% say religion was not relevant in their hate crime experience. 6% do not answer. Regarding media and Muslims, 88% believe that the reason why non-Muslims in Switzerland have negative feelings against the Muslims in Switzerland is because of the role of the media. 4% say that the role of the media has no such effect. 8% do not answer. We have contacted the Ethics Commission of the Swiss Association of Communication and Media Research. This is an umbrella organization of media education, journalist education, about these alarming results and asked them whether they are aware of this phenomenon. We offered a dialogue to discuss this problem, and we will keep you informed about any results. How was this poll received by the civil society? This poll was published in January 2018. Until today, none of the 7 Muslim carriers have been contacted. Muslim NGOs have contacted the Federal Commission to fight against racism, although 10 months passed. The Commission didn't respond.
May I kindly ask the speaker to conclude?
Yes. Recently, we also contacted labor unions, the Conference of Educational Ministers, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch Switzerland. You will find our my speech in the document center. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Madam Moderator, dear participants, the Republic of Tajikistan abides by all international and regional initiatives, and we condemn any form of discrimination and intolerance on religious, ethnic, racial, and other grounds. Moving on to recommendations, we'd like to note that Tajikistan deeply regrets the fact that the OSCE is used or provides a platform for organizations whose ideology is based on religious intolerance, the propaganda of violence, and anti-Semitic content. Let me give you a few examples from what was said by the founder and spiritual father of the Islamic Renewal Party that is prohibited in Tajikistan. This author calls for killing Muslim citizens, even if they are Muslim, but if they do not abide by the same ideology. On page 198, you can see that the author says that those who live in enemy territory, even if they are Muslim, but that they do not join the party, they are heretics and should be treated as such. So their property can be confiscated, their blood can be spilled, and their matrimonies are not recognized. Such official publications from this party exist for other religions as well, including Christians and Jews. For instance, this party propagands violence against Christians and Jews in a book called Why Did You Turn Away from Islam? And in pages 33 to 39, they talk of a falsification of there is a falsification of the protocols of the Zionist wise men, and there are calls to end Jewish supremacy over the world. On page 39, hatred towards Christians is promoted, and over the years in Tajikistan, this party has the Center for Islamic Studies has carried out religious expertise over these publications, and I would say that every meter here is covered with.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the next speaker on the list.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. My name is Alexei Semenov. Every year, the procession of the cross takes place in Kiev in honor of the baptism of Rus. This is one of the most respected and ancient traditions that exist in the Christian Orthodox Church. At the end of July, there were held two religious processions. The first was organized on July 27 by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. There are more than 250,000 people took part in it. The second was organized the next day by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kiev Patriarchate, attended by officials including the President of Ukraine Petro Poroshenko, the Mayor of Kiev Vitaly Klitschko, members of the government, etc. About 60,000 people took part in it. The Ukrainian media organized a propaganda campaign against the procession of the Moscow Patriarchate. Outright disinformation and hate speech were widely used in that campaign. It was alleged that the participants of the Moscow procession, who gathered from all over Ukraine, did it for money, although that procession had 4 times more participants than the official one attended by the President of Ukraine. Radical Ukrainian nationalist organizations blocked the passage of pilgrims to Kiev. They also threatened to burn buses that would take pilgrims to the first procession. Individual representatives of government bodies and law enforcement agencies also prevented the arrivals of pilgrims to Kiev. In the Ukrainian media and social networks, there was a smear campaign directed against the procession of the Moscow Patriarchate, which was called the procession of the state church of the enemy country. Offensive epithets were widely used against the participants. The incitement of hatred...
May I kindly ask the speaker to conclude?
The incitement of hatred on the part of the Ukrainian media on the religious ground is contrary to the basic human rights commitments adopted within the
Sir, please
OSCE.
conclude.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the next speaker on the list.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much.
Our center for many years has been dealing with analyzing xenophobia and religious discrimination in Europe. These have been on the rise, and I would like to give you some information. Anti-Semitism rise in France is up 10%, in Hungary plus 7%, in Italy it's up 1%. The highest level of anti-Semitism has been recorded in Greece, 69%. This country for many years have been the most anti-Semitic country in Europe. After is Poland, 33% of anti-Semitist sentiment. And there are over 1,000 Jews registered in Poland, very few, in fact. There's a high level of anti-Semitism in Slovakia, 30%, in Ukraine, 29%. Amongst Catholics in Ukraine, the level of anti-Semitism is higher than amongst the Orthodox, 48%. There are positive trends only in the UK. It's down 2%, in Poland, 4%, and in Russia, it's down 4%. Special attention I would like to focus on Ukraine. The General Prosecutor's Office of Ukraine gives some information on anti-Semitism and on hate crimes, which are distorted. They talk about 65% of overall hate crimes in the country. But based on NGOs' information affiliated with the Ukrainian government, they talked about 41 instances of anti-Semitism. The basis is the law approved in Ukraine on the honor of combatants in the 21st century. There's a list of these organizations, which is UNOP, which was very well known for the Jewish pogrom in 1941 and against the Polish. If the Ukrainian anti-Semist combatants are now heroes, they see nothing wrong with anti-Semitism. I would like to. I have requested that the OSCE should keep control of the situation. I disagree with the way you have been leading this session. Thank you.
I turn the floor over to the next speaker on the list.
Thank you. The full text of this statement will be distributed. Madam Moderator, our efforts to prevent and combat intolerance and non-discrimination on religious grounds cannot be considered apart from the long-standing OSCE commitments on freedom of religion or belief. A certain misconceived notion of tolerance cannot be an excuse for denying or not guaranteeing religious freedom. A particularly worrisome development is the fact that across the OSCE region, a sharp dividing line seems to have been drawn between religious belief and religious practice. Christians are frequently reminded in public discourse or even in the courts that they can believe whatever they like in private and worship as they wish in their own churches, but they are prohibited from acting on those beliefs in public, and Professor Martinez spoke on this in his introduction. Anti-Christian discrimination has become the last acceptable form of prejudice, seems to receive less attention than other forms of intolerance, in part because of Christianity's position as the historically dominant religion. In conclusion, the root cause of discrimination and intolerance against Christians within the OSCE region may be summarized as a weakening of the freedom of religion or belief, or to be more precise, a troubling limitation of what this fundamental freedom actually entails. I close by thanking on behalf of the Holy See the three personal representatives of the CIO for their work. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Dear participants of the meeting, I am Bishop Victor and I represent the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Since 2015, each OSCE meeting on religious rights and freedoms has addressed the topic of violation of the believers' rights of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Today I would like to say about the situation of our church in Ukraine being the largest denomination in the country at the moment. The Ukrainian legislation conforms to democratic standards. In Ukraine, the rule of law and religious freedoms are recognized de jure, yet we could have avoided many difficulties if the implementation of these laws were carried out in practice. I very much regret to say that violations of the rights of our confession have not ceased. As a result of the conflicts, more than 40 temples of our denomination have been illegally seized today. Let me show you the most exemplary cases. In Katerinovka village of Ternopil region, policemen beat up our believers with rubber clubs. In Ptija village Rovno region, the temple, being the property of our community, was arrested by an odious court decision. This fact is indicative in a criminal cases, as it proves the destruction of the property institution in the state. Despite the fact that our parliament has adopted bills being positive for religious organization, 3 draft laws with acts of discrimination against our faith still remain on the parliament's agenda. Despite the peacemaking ministry of the UFC across the whole Ukraine, some politicians publicly blame our faith in anti-Ukraine activities without any evidence thereto. Hate speech penetrates even the decision of public authorities. Our arguments that the issue of the creation of a single local church should be the prerogative of the church rather than the state fall on deaf ears. Politicians employ their entire diplomatic and administrative resources to create a new local church, forgetting that according to the constitution of Ukraine, this is not their competence. We must say we consider the situation as threatening to the religious peace in the country.
I kindly ask the speaker to conclude.
So we urge Ukraine to strengthen the protection of religious freedoms by real actions and request the participants present here to help protection the rights of believers in Ukraine. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I now turn the floor over to the next speaker on the list.
Distinguished participants, I would like to recommend that the OEC should focus on the overall trend of the violation of canonical laws in Ukraine, Montenegro, and others. It is the rights of non-canonical Orthodox Church rights are also being violated. There are very many violations of the rights of worshippers. For example, the worshippers of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church have been part of a database, Peacekeeper, which is an extremist site. Many are still unpunished. For example, cases were opened against worshippers and are not being investigated. Very often, people are forced in church jurisdictions to change their religion. There are also structures to stand in the way of the practice of certain churches. The police have stood in the way of the church services in Montenegro. There were draft laws in Montenegro with regard to changing jurisprudence, the nationalization of church property that was accumulated by the worshippers before 1918. The EU states have taken on commitments for restitution of stolen property. The Orthodox Montenegro Church and the Macedonian Orthodox Church has also seized property of the church, as well as dealing with the Serbian Orthodox Church. I would like to vote that the Constantinople Patriarch has often said that Macedonian and churches have also been dealing with religious intolerance. We need to solve these issues through diplomacy efforts. And these efforts need to be resolved without the interference of the government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Good afternoon. Uspešny Varti, the Human Rights Platform from Ukraine. We would like the OEC to recommend to Ukraine to ensure the right to religious freedom for citizens of all religions. As was already mentioned today by others, in Ukraine, there's an active political administrative pressure against the clergy and the worshippers of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church to force them to accept the projects of Synagogue. This is meddling against religious organizations that is banned by the Constitution. In the past 4 years, there's a wave of aggression against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and its worshippers, which is the result of defamation, propaganda, and discrimination by the media and politicians. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the west of Ukraine and other regions have been victims of mass assault in order to seize their churches and to transfer this to the non-canonical patriarch. Our platform provides for legal assistance to a church in Parafia. It is in the Donetsk region of Konstantinovka. In 2015, the church was seized by voluntary regiments against the agreement of being loyal to the Kiev Patriarch and the religious belonging. Now, in June, the Supreme Court formally canceled the court's decisions, and this case went back to the lower court. Now, the community has not had access to its church over all this time. We are continuing our battle legally. We have also seen facts of assault against the clergy and vandalism by far-right radicals of the Azov and other radical groups. The police is not preventing these acts of violence, and no one is held accountable. We request that the OSCE should focus on these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Good morning to one and all. Now, as I have already said, for centuries, the media have been used as a tool with which to manipulate people. If you look at the last century, fascism is a case in point, then communism as well. Now we have an enemy that has been created by media hype, terrorists and Islamists, and this needs to be addressed. Islam is actually a road to happiness for all of us. Islam is civilization. Islam is progressive. Islam is equality between men and women. Islam is a form of justice and respect for human rights. That's why we need to be very careful when choosing the terms we use and be more meticulous. In April 2016, an international Islamic academy was established in Tashkent. 60 girls who wore the traditional veil were expelled from this institution and for concealing their identities. Today, as the new president of our country tells the entire world, and he speaks gives lots of fine speeches, but the situation is not as rosy as he would have it. The teachers of this institution are threatened from dismissal if they won't remove their headwear. Around 30 bloggers have been detained. Most of them have been released afterwards, but they were detained. And one of them, yes, please respect the rights in Uzbekistan. Thank you. Let's live in peace and harmony.
Thank you very much. Before I turn over to the next speaker, a kind reminder, if delegations would like to exercise their right of reply, to come see my colleague and sign up on the list. And I now give the floor to the next speaker.
Religious Management of Muslims of Autonomous Republic of Crimea, and I would like to greet everyone here. The repressive Russian machine in Crimea works day in, day out, and arrests ever more people, grievously violating the right to freedom of religion. Sima Akalyev, the father and mother and daughter, were arrested because they uploaded religious symbols online. There are many such cases, Maria Yusvaeva and others, including a journalist who have been accused of online activities, and religion is also used as a means to threaten civil society activists. 130 children in Crimea are now without the care of their parents because their parents are sitting in prison, and Muslims cannot eat pork, but this is not respected, and the Crimean Muslims are not the only affected by this. There have been raids not just in mosques but also in homes, and this has happened in Simferopol and other places. And the purpose of these raids is to find prohibited literature, or literature prohibited by Russian law. And since March 2014, so from the very start of the occupation by Russia, there has been systematic repression by Russia of certain communities, and these repressions are politically motivated. They tend to kick in retroactively, and so they repress people who did inconvenient activities before 2014 as well, and many people are forced to leave Crimea as a consequence for this. We call for discrimination on religious grounds to be ended, and we would like the right of the people of Crimea to exercise their belief to be upheld. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Благодарю.
Thank you. There are many difficult issues which are directly or indirectly linked to the topic we are discussing. This spreading of religious content, religious beliefs, missionary activities, religious services outside of churches. They are also covered by the issues of tolerance and non-discrimination. Unfortunately, there isn't very much time. We've seen that because of people's religion, certain religious communities and their members today do not have access to courts and a fair investigation, and also to hold independent and quality expertise. We see that people who work in Central Asian specialized services actively use bloggers or claim to be bloggers, and at the same time use the language of hatred and spread intolerance with regard to religious minorities. Religious minorities need to be greater involved in special workshops and platforms for discussion. Through this, we will promote tolerance for different religions. The media play an important role in supporting tolerance. We need to have government programs in involving religious minorities in areas where they can have access to the media, so we can have public debate without fearing being mocked, because often what they say is distorted and marginalized. We also need to make sure that the legislative branch should play an important role in creating special laws. We have recommendations for Kazakhstan to adopt administrative and legal and administrative measures to create anti-discriminatory mechanisms and procedures, and also to define discrimination in the law with regard to people who are victims of discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Good afternoon. My name is Mr. Polozov. I'm a Russian lawyer, and I deal directly with the human rights defense in Crimea. Before me, the Mufti of Crimea spoke. He touched upon the issue of the persecution of Muslims in occupied Crimea. I would like to touch upon some other aspects of religious persecution, and that is the work of the Russian authorities in Crimea against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, where they have seized property and churches. The de facto ban of religious services of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church clergy, Mr. Klementov, and other instances of harassment. And this isn't only in Crimea, but also in the Russian Federation, the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses. There have been different trials held in Russia. And in Crimea, after one such trial, one of the members of the Jehovah's Witness members basically had a heart attack right in court. He could not withstand all of that pressure. Let's understand clearly that the Russian authorities use the religious organizations to promote their own agenda. And here, this is against the constitution of the Russian Federation as well as international treaties that provide for the full separation of church and state. Unfortunately, in Russia, these principles have not been respected, and on the contrary, they are used to promote political agenda.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the next speaker on the list.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Mike Davidson. I am the CEO of Core Issues Trust, a Christian charity based in the United Kingdom. On the 3rd of July 2018, supported by the LGBT National Survey report, the UK government stated its intention as one point of its LGBT action plan to ban conversion therapy. We're concerned about the intolerance and issues raised for persons who were once gay in the United Kingdom. The LGBT National Survey was flawed. The most serious concern, and others are listed in a paper deposited for the purpose of this meeting, is the fact that it asks respondents whether or not they have been offered conversion therapy without defining what is meant by the term. Here is our concern. Conversion therapy is an imposed term. The term was first used by psychologist, LGBT activist, Dr. Douglas Helderman in 1994. This is not terminology of the Christian or any other religious community, nor of qualified therapists willing to work with clients whose self-determined goal is to explore their heterosexual potential. Rather, the term is used by secular professionals who have effectively coined the term as a catch-all name for the worst practices and that advocates of a ban want governments and the public to believe about how sessions with these seeking help function. I've listed 5 recommendations which we hope that the OSCE will consider. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to our next speaker on the list.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. The full version will be distributed later on, and let me now bring key points and recommendation forward. Armenia is particularly concerned with the existential threats that Christians and Yazidis face today in the OSCE neighboring regions, but also in certain OSCE participating states. Hate crimes and mass atrocities that target Christians and Yazidis, their cultural heritage and property, have been continuously marked by identity-motivated bias and intent. The Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, 70th anniversary, which we will mark this year, clearly identifies religious groups as protected community under the international law. Thus, the state parties to the Convention hold an international obligation to prevent genocide against religious groups. Last November, Armenia hosted a joint conference, OSCE Chairmanship ODIHR Conference on Preventing and Countering Hate Crimes against Christians and members of the other religious groups. We are pleased that this conference provided an excellent platform to discuss ways of addressing hate crimes against Christians and come up with important recommendations. In conclusion, let me offer 2 recommendations. We recommend to the participating states to empower religious groups, members of the religious groups who were subject of mass atrocities, to use their right to the truth aimed at rehabilitation and reconciliation. We recommend to the ODIHR to follow up with the Yerevan Conference on Preventing and Countering Hate Crimes against Christians and members of other religious groups and its recommendations. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And with this last speaker, we've come to the end of the speaker list, and I will be moving to the right of reply. I have 11 right of replies at the moment, so we'll give each delegation just a tad bit more than a minute, so we'll put a minute on the clock. I will start with Germany.
Vielen Dank, Frau Vorsitzende.
Thank you very much, moderator. I wanted to talk to you about events in Chemnitz. There are videos, a lot of testimonies with regard to the demonstrations in Chemnitz that took place at the end of August. Now, all of this happened after the murder of a young German man who was stabbed. These testimonies and videos show that people of foreign origin were harassed, and German journalists as well. And the government and the Bundestag condemned this. The federal government condemns all forms of xenophobia and racism, no matter who the victims of this intolerance may be. Combating discrimination is at the heart of the rule of law of our government. We need to make sure that people who have perpetrated these crimes should be held to account, especially with regard to the investigations that have already been launched. What's more, for this, we need to have prevention, education, and information, and a courageous and committed civil society. And there are many different programs that are necessary to do this. There are many programs in existence, including in the Federal Ministry for the Family. Thank you.
Very much. I'll now move to Austria, who will be followed by Greece. Austria, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mrs. Moderator. Freedom of religion is secured in the Austrian constitution, individually, collectively, and cooperatively. There are 16 recognized religious societies in Austria, and in addition, we have some state-registered religious communities. Religious societies have, among others, the right to offer religious education in public schools. Furthermore, a Levite church tax is tax deductible, and religious sites are exempt from real estate tax. About 700,000 Muslims are currently living in Austria, about 8% of the total population, organized into Islamic religious societies in Austria. This means the Islamic community in Austria, the Islamic Alevi community in Austria, and in one Islamic state-registered religious community, the Shiite Muslim religious community in Austria. Austria, by means of the Islam law of 2015, protects and enables the religious freedom of Muslims in Austria. The law on Islam was developed over a period of 3 years. All Islamic religious societies were included in all phases of development. Moreover, civil society representatives as well as Islamic scientists and legal experts were included.
May I kindly ask the speaker to conclude?
The Islamic Academy, this is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A move to Greece will be followed by Belgium.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. In reply to 2 NGO statements, I would like to stress that the region of Thrace is an example of harmonious and successful living together of a Christian majority and a Muslim minority. Any incident which may or may not be identified as hate crime is thoroughly investigated. The Ministry of Education takes special care for the promotion of the religious and spiritual cultivation of Muslims in Thrace, where 260 mosques are in operation. Thus, all Muslim minority pupils at public schools in Thrace have the possibility to be taught the Quran at school and not at special classes by Islamic religion teachers specially appointed by the state. The Ministry of Education has decided to launch a pilot program in 6 public kindergartens, where, alongside the main educator in the classroom, there will be language facilitators in the mother tongue of the children. Finally, proper legal adjustments have been made in order to expedite the construction of the Athens Mosque, which has already begun and is nearing completion. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much. I now move to Belgium, who will be followed by Hungary.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. In Belgium, each foreigner has the right to file a request for asylum, which is studied by the relevant administration, which is an independent federal office. And we study each asylum request in an impartial, objective, and individual way in accordance with international and Belgium law. Secondly, freedom of expression is guaranteed by Belgium constitution because it is essential for the proper functioning of a democratic society. However, the prohibition of incitement to hatred is a legal restriction of the freedom of expression. And the Belgian legal authorities have begun an investigation following media revelations about a group of students that had an hidden agenda linked to xenophobia and far-right activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Hungary, who will be followed by the Netherlands.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In reply to the Church of Scientology, I would like to state the following. The freedom of religion and belief is secured by the fundamental law of Hungary for everyone. This means that the Church of Scientology can exercise its religion without any restriction as a religious association and allowed to use the title of a church. The ongoing administrative and criminal procedure doesn't have any effect on the freedom of religion or belief. These procedures started because of the violation of data protection regulation and several part of the criminal code, which were justified by the Supreme Court of Hungary. It should be mentioned that similar procedure took place with regard to the Church of Scientology in several European states. With regard to the criticism of our first introducer, I would like to highlight that tomorrow afternoon session we will have plenty of opportunity to address the discrimination against Roma and Sinti, among other the segregation of school children of Roma. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the Netherlands, which will be followed by Switzerland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to exercise the right of reply regarding what has been said by the representative of Human Rights Without Borders. We appreciate your constant efforts for freedom of religion and belief and for reporting on cases. Regarding requests for asylum, the procedure for asylum in the Netherlands is the same for every applicant, and requests are assessed on a case-by-case basis, taking into account the specifics of every case and country. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much. I turn now to Switzerland, which will be followed by France.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. First, in response to Human Rights Without Frontiers International regarding asylum cases of members of Chinese Church of Almighty God in Switzerland, we thank you for raising the issue and would like to state that we are at the disposal to orientate your organization towards the following questions related to asylum procedure in Switzerland. Who is considered a refugee, what the legal basis is, how the asylum procedure in Switzerland works, and what institutions and authorities are responsible. Second, in response to the Union of European Turkish Democrats regarding their survey, which, like at the 2017 HDIM, we duly take into consideration. We would like to remind that the Swiss government initiated regular dialogue with the Muslim community and draw as well the attention on the Swiss Council of Religions established in 2006 and which the Swiss government looks favorably, as their aims are to favor mutual comprehension, to create a climate of confidence and tolerance between the religions, to keep and promote religious peace in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I turn now to France, which will be followed by the United Kingdom.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 2 points. First of all, concerning asylum, France has ratified the Geneva Convention from 1951, and it is on that basis that we examine asylum requests that are submitted to it. This process is done by a specific independent body. The decisions can be challenged through legal processes with all the safeguards that are included therein. Secondly, on secularism. Secularism is, let me remind you, a principle of freedom. It involves the implementation of our national motto, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, when it comes to faith and confession. It is from secularism that religious but also political and philosophical neutrality stems when we're talking of our public officials. The freedom of confession is the rule, and it can only be restricted in certain cases for substantiated reasons linked to security or the core interests of a company. And of course, let me stress that this is subjected to judicial oversight as a form of guaranteeing individual freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the United Kingdom, to be followed by Uzbekistan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wish to respond briefly to 3 points. Firstly, with due respect to the introductory speaker, I hope I can reassure her that I don't recognise her description of growing pressure for dress restrictions in the UK. I would say that controversial remarks by individual commentators do not add up to growing pressure. Secondly, Dr. Chennai referred to the non-publication of some reports. I'm not sure if he's here now. As far as the UK visit was concerned, I can say that this relates to very significant concerns about the coherence and integrity of the draft report. But the United Kingdom continues with other OSCE states to engage with successive chairmanships constructively on how the appointment of personal representatives with a tolerance and non-discrimination portfolio can be used most effectively, along with other OSCE resource to reduce intolerance and discrimination in the region. Thirdly, to the representative of CAGE, the organisation CAGE, I respect her right to express her views on any matter of UK government policy, and that includes criticism of the Prevent policy. But this is not a question of freedom of religious belief. The Prevent policy does not target any specific faith or group, but is designed to tackle all forms of extremism. It is about safeguarding and supporting vulnerable individuals, and it works along other strands of activity to protect communities. She also raised a separate issue of safeguarding action taken by the family courts, also not a matter of freedom of religion or belief, but I understand that about 100 children have been safeguarded to prevent them being taken to conflict areas. Finally, if you will allow, I should add, Madam Chair, in all cases, action taken by the UK authorities has to be proportionate and comply with human rights legislation and commitments. And finally, if you allow, Madam Chair, I might just say the remarks made by the Core Issues Trust were not actually strictly on the topic of today's discussion, but I will use this occasion briefly to respond by saying the UK is a strong supporter of LGBT equality and sexual orientation is not an illness to be cured. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Uzbekistan, to be followed by Kazakhstan.
Thank you very much, Moderator. I would like to draw your attention to 2 aspects. Firstly, I would like to underscore that the freedom of religion and belief is guaranteed by the Constitution of Uzbekistan. What is one of the priorities of our public policy is to promote a culture of tolerance and to build interfaith tolerance and peace. Today, we've heard statements with regard to the expulsion of students. I would like to note that the interaction between universities and students is covered by the rules of procedures of these schools and the relevant decisions of the Ministry of Higher and Special Education. Any arrest or detaining of anyone is in line with the laws of Uzbekistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Kazakhstan, to be followed by Luxembourg on behalf of the European Union.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I'd like to say a few things in response to what Mr. Khrushchev said. In Kazakhstan, we attach great importance to ensuring the right to freedom of religion and to the free functioning of religious organizations. All religious associations are allowed to practice their faith, and they are not hampered as long as they abide by the law. We do this to both traditional and non-traditional organizations, large and small, and some of them are state-run or mandatory. There are 18 religious confessions in Kazakhstan, including Islam, Orthodox Christianity, Catholicism, and others. Kazakhstan is home to a broad spectrum of religious faiths, and despite the fact that most people in Kazakhstan are Muslims, 87%, the they're not. The presence of some slightly fanatic elements does not prevent non-fanatical ones from practicing their faith. Churches are allowed to form associations, and there are today we have our own model for policy in the religious field. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Luxembourg on behalf of the European Union, which will be followed by Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I'm speaking on behalf of the EU in reply to several statements made during the session. The European Union promotes freedom of religion or belief as a right to be exercised by everyone, everywhere, based on the principles of equality, non-discrimination, and universality. The EU focuses on the right of individuals to believe or not to believe, and, alone or in community with others, to freely manifest their beliefs, including the right to change one's religion or belief or to renounce it. The EU does not consider the merits of the different religions or belief, or the lack thereof, but ensures that the right to believe or not to believe is upheld. The EU raises constantly the issue of freedom of religion or belief in its annual human rights dialogue with China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there's another microphone on by you. Thank you. And I now turn to Ukraine, which is the last right of reply I have. So the floor is yours.
It's a great pity that official representatives of the Russian Federation, as well as some religious and non-profit organizations whose centers are located or financed by Russia, are trying to use religious problematic as a tool for reaching concrete political aims. That's why incorrect facts and systematic manipulation are the specific features of this type of presentations. Firstly, Ukraine doesn't have a problem of so-called seizure of churches of the Moscow Patriarchate. We have just realization and practice a right of any communities to change their canonical affiliation. This right is completely correlates with any religious documents and recommendations. Second, process of preparation and granting canonical autocephaly for the dominating majority of Orthodox followers in the country doesn't have any political involvement from the side of the Ukrainian government. This process is realizing exclusively according to the ecclesiastical procedures. Complete confirmation of that is supporting and leading it by the ecumenical patriarch in general and Patriarch Bartholomew particularly. Thirdly, despite the fact that the Moscow Patriarchate is a minority inside an Orthodox community, government constantly repeat its permanent position. All right of followers who will decide to remain in a structure of Russian Orthodox Church will be secured and guaranteed. So aggressive opposition and unjustified accusation concerning the process of realization the idea of autocephaly is just a form of including this aspect into the contemporary Russian hybrid war against Ukraine and Europe.
May I kindly ask the speaker to conclude?
Okay, 1 second. This campaign presupposes not a securing the right of religious organization, but realization as a pragmatic interest of one religious institution, Moscow Patriarchate, which constantly losing its position in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this point, we've reached the end of the right of reply and the end of the session. I'd like to thank the speakers and the audience. I'd like to particularly thank the interpreters for all of their work. I would like to remind you that the speakers list is open 1 hour before the session starts, and that you're advised to arrive early, as when we reach the list of 50, the list is closed. Please note that only participants present with their own badge can sign up to the list of speakers. Please leave your headset and receiver in the room. And as a final note, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that we have arranged for participants in the HGym to have free entrance to the Poland Museum, History of Jews in Poland. So we urge you to take advantage of that benefit as well. And I invite you now to the side events. Thank you very much.